Since the 1960s, our government has been engaged in a war against crime and drug use. In this video, we will cover a brief history of this domestic war, explore its statistical and communal impacts, and answer the question, is our nation heading in the right direction?
I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive. I have asked the Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offensive. This will be a worldwide offensive.
President Nixon's concerns were not unfounded. Violent crime began to skyrocket in the 60s, following a historical low in the aftermath of World War II. Drug abuse was determined to directly correlate with this increase in crime. When Ronald Reagan took office, crime was worse than it had ever been before.
Those of you engaged in law enforcement have struggled long and hard in what must often have seemed like a losing war against the menace of crime. I'm grateful to you for that, and so are the American people. But besides being grateful, I have some good news for you. A major initiative that I believe can mark a turning point in the battle against crime.
By 1989, the majority of Americans saw drug abuse as the nation's number one problem. When Bill Clinton took office, crime rates were at their highest in all of U.S. history. In 1994, Clinton signed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act.
Gangs and drugs have taken over our streets and undermined our schools. Every day we read about somebody else who has literally gotten away with murder. But the American people haven't forgotten the difference between right and wrong.
The crime bill aimed to fight crime and drug abuse by incentivizing states to give harsher sentences to those convicted of drug and violent crimes and providing federal funding to the expansion of prison systems and the police force.
We will have the means by which we can say punishment will be more certain. We will cut the federal workforce over a period of years by 270,000 positions to its lowest level in 30 years and take all that money to pay for this crime bill. So in that spirit, let us rededicate ourselves today to making this law become the life of our country, to restoring the sense of right and wrong that built our country, and to make it safe, not in words, but in fact, in the lifeblood of every child and every citizen of this country who believes in the promise of America. Let us make it real. Thank you, and God bless you all.
After this act was passed, the crime wave that started in the 60s had completely reversed. Since 1994, crime in the United States has been steadily decreasing. This decline, however, came at the expense of mass incarceration. From 1994 to 2009, state and federal prison populations, which had already been rapidly increasing, doubled. Despite holding only 5% of the world's population, the United States holds nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. The sentencing and policing policy pushed by politicians during this time not only imprisoned more people than in any other country, but also disproportionately affected communities of color. While the sale of illegal drugs by race remains proportionate to population within the U.S., over half of those imprisoned for the sale and possession of drugs are people of color. Perhaps the best example of how this came to be lies in the disparity between crack and cocaine. While essentially the exact same drug, distribution of just 5 grams of crack carries a minimum 5-year federal prison sentence, whereas the distribution of 500 grams of powder cocaine carries the same sentence. Not only was this not based in any scientific reasoning, but it served as an effective method to imprison Black Americans, as crack was far more commonly used in poor communities, whereas cocaine was used in more wealthy communities, largely by white Americans. When Clinton had the opportunity to sign legislation eliminating this disparity, he elected not to.
We need to take these people on. They are often connected to big drug cartels. They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel. And the President has asked the FBI to launch a very concerted effort against gangs everywhere.
Not everyone supported the tough-on-crime stance of presidents from Nixon to Bush. Movements to reform the trends of mass incarceration and unjust sentencing gained great public support during the mid-2000s. President Obama reflected this change by often speaking on the importance of criminal justice reform. During his 2 terms, 2 pieces of bipartisan legislation were passed, which were the Fair Sentencing Act, reducing the disparity between crack and cocaine from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1, and the Smart on Crime initiative, which was intended to decrease the prosecution of nonviolent, low-level drug offenders, seeing some marginal success. The most significant advancement in criminal justice reform was marked by President Trump's signature on the First Step Act, which became law in December of 2018 after passing with overwhelming bipartisan support in Congress.
How significant do you think this is? By the way, one of your partners in working on this was Jared Kushner.
Jared Kushner, whose father went to prison and who fought on this as hard as that. This is history. This is history. Right now, you're witnessing history on the floor of the U.S. Senate. It is a Christmas miracle underway where, for the first time in a generation, Republicans and Democrats are arm in arm tonight saying, we are sending too many people to prison. They're coming out bitter and not better. We want to make a tremendous difference. I want to say Hakeem Jeffries on the left, Jared Kushner, and Donald Trump on the right.
During his State of the Union speech in February, Trump highlighted the importance of rehabilitation and fair sentencing by speaking about the First Step Act and inviting a few men and women who the act has helped build a new life.
And just weeks ago, both parties united for groundbreaking criminal justice reform.
This bill contains a variety of provisions aimed at rehabilitation as opposed to punishment, which directly will benefit the nearly 200,000 inmates in federal prison. Since it has been signed into law, over 1,000 inmates have had their sentences shortened by an average of 73 months, and 12 states have enacted similar legislation at the state level. This progress and its bipartisan nature is what our nation needs in order to assure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to all Americans. While we still have a long way to go, our nation is headed in the right direction.